the battle raged across the frozen surface of Station Omega-7 with the kind of intensity that turned veteran soldiers into trembling wrecks, and Station Omega-7 was losing and losing badly, and the Severan Empire had sent 3 full battle groups to crush the human outpost and claim the strategic position that controlled the entire Kaldrith Nebula. And if the station fell, then 7 colony worlds would be cut off from supply lines and millions would die, and everyone knew its squad leader. Kelthus stood on the outer defense platform with his 4 arms, checking weapon systems and tactical displays, and his scaled purple skin reflected the red emergency lights that bathed everything in blood-colored shadows, and he had seen 200 years of combat across a dozen wars. But this fight felt different and felt wrong, and the enemy was too organized and too focused and too willing to throw away troops just to probe their defenses. Ren moved beside him and the crystalline soldiers. Body caught the explosions from distant bombardments and turned them into rainbow patterns across his transparent form, and he was checking the shield generators for the 3rd time in 10 minutes because the Severan bombardment was relentless. And the shields were holding at 60%, but that number kept dropping, and Vryn did not like numbers that kept dropping. Kura floated near the command console with her elongated head tilted in concentration, and her people did not have eyes like other species, but perceived the world through telepathic waves, and right now, those waves were screaming with the thoughts of 3,000 defenders, all feeling fear and determination in equal measure, and she filtered through the mental noise to coordinate squad movements and keep everyone fighting as one unified force. The 44th Tactical Response Unit had earned their reputation through 17 straight victories against impossible odds, and they were the best of the best, and pulled from a dozen different species across the galaxy and trained to work as a single organism, and other units called them the Unbreakables, because no enemy had ever broken their formation, or scattered their lines, or made them retreat. Kelthas watched the tactical display and saw enemy forces massing for another push against the eastern perimeter, and he opened the squad channel and gave orders in the clipped-efficient manner that saved lives and conserved breath, and within seconds, his people were moving to intercept, and the coordination was flawless and beautiful in the way that only perfect training could achieve. The Severan came in waves in their battle. Armor gleamed silver and black, and they moved with the confidence of an empire that had conquered half the known galaxy, and their weapons tore through defensive barriers and melted armor and turned soldiers into vapor. But the 44th held the line and gave ground only when tactically advantageous, and made the enemy pay for every meter in blood. Kelth's lead a countercharge with his squad following in perfect formation, and his weapons blazed and cut through enemy shields, and he felt the familiar rhythm of combat settle over him like an old coat, and comfortable and well-worn, and he had done this so many times that his body moved on instinct, while his mind calculated trajectories and firing solutions and tactical adjustments from absorbed 3 direct hits from plasma cannons and redirected the energy back at the attackers in a focused beam that cut through their ranks like a blade through smoke. And his crystalline structure was designed for exactly this kind of combat, and he was effectively immortal as long as he had energy to absorb, and there was always energy on a battlefield. Kira reached into the minds of advancing enemies and found their tactical frequencies and fed false information that sent 2 squads running directly into prepared kill zones in her species. Considered this kind of mental warfare distasteful, but effective and right. Now effective was all that mattered. The battle continued for 6 hours, straight without pause, and the defenders held but barely, and casualty reports kept climbing in supply. Caches kept depleting, and everyone knew they could not sustain this level of combat for much longer, and reinforcements were 3 days away, and 3 days might as well be 3 years. Then something changed. Selphas noticed it first on the tactical display, and a gap in the Severan formation that made no tactical sense in enemy units pulling back from a position they had almost taken, and confused chatter on intercepted communications, and something about an unknown contact, and then the communications went silent. The silence lasted exactly 47 seconds. eastern perimeter exploded with violet fire that reached up into the sky like a pillar connecting ground to stars in the flames, moved with purpose and intelligence, and carved through. Severan battle mechs, like they were made of paper and soldiers, scattered and died in their screams. Cut off almost before they began, Cletha switched his visual feeds to the eastern cameras and saw something that made his tactical mind stumble. And a young woman walked through the burning battlefield with silver hair that flowed behind her despite the lack of wind, and her ears were pointed and rose above her head in a way that marked her as something from old legends, and she wore armor that seemed to shift between metal and leather and energy, and carried a rifle that glowed with runes. Beside her walked a dragon, not a creature that looked like a dragon or some alien species that resembled the mythical beasts from old Earth stories, but an actual dragon, and massive and covered in scales that shimmered between black and deep purple, and its eyes burned with violet fire, and its wings were folded against its back, but everyone could see they would span 50 meters when spread. The woman moved without hurry, and her pace was steady and calm, like she was taking an evening walk through a garden instead of a battlefield. Her thousands fought and died, and her dragon companion moved with her in perfect synchronization, and their bond was visible in the way they never looked at each other, but always knew where the other was. A Severan battlemech turned its weapons on them and fired, and the plasma bolts that could vaporize armored vehicles struck the dragon's side and simply disappeared and absorbed into those shimmering scales, and the dragon turned its head almost lazily and opened its mouth, and violet flames poured out in a concentrated stream that melted the 60-ton war machine into slag in under 3 seconds. Woman raised her rifle and fired, and the shot left a trail of silver light and struck a Severan command vehicle, and the entire thing exploded from the inside out. And then she fired again and again, and each shot was perfect, and each shot found something vital and destroyed it. Compella Clathis tried to hail her on all frequencies and emergency bands, and even old analog radio, but got nothing, and she did not acknowledge their attempts at communication, and did not slow her advance, and did not show any sign she even knew the 44th Exist. Edvin watched through the tactical feed and calculated the destruction she was causing, and his crystalline mind was built for math and probabilities, and the numbers he was seeing made no sense. And one person and one dragon were dismantling an entire battalion in real time, and the efficiency was beyond anything in his tactical data. Basekia reached out with her telepathic senses and tried to touch the woman's mind, and found nothing, and complete emptiness, like reaching for something in the dark and finding only void, and that should have been impossible, because every living thing had some kind of mental presence, and even the most disciplined minds showed something, but this woman showed nothing at all. The dragon was worse, and when Kira's telepathic probe touched its consciousness, she recoiled instantly, and the dragon's mind was vast and ancient and aware, and it had noticed her intrusion and regarded her with something between amusement and warning, and she pulled back her senses and decided that trying to read the dragon's mind was a spectacularly bad idea. The woman and her dragon spent exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds on the eastern perimeter, and in that time they eliminated an entire Severan battalion and destroyed 12 battle mechs and 47 armored vehicles, and killed or scattered 362 soldiers, and then they simply walked away. The woman approached the defensive wall, and her dragon lowered its massive head, and she climbed onto its back with practiced ease, and the dragon's wings spread, and the span was actually closer to 70 meters, and with 2 powerful strokes, they were airborne and rising into the smoke-filled sky. Kelthas ordered all units to track them and keep visual contact and find out where they were going, but the dragon simply disappeared, and one moment it was visible against the burning sky, and the next it was gone, and spatial sensors showed a dimensional rift opening and closing in less than a second, and then nothing. The Severan forces broke and retreated after that, and their morale shattered by whatever that woman and her dragon represented, and the battle was won, but nobody celebrated because everyone was trying to understand what they had just witnessed. It stood in the command center 2 hours later and reviewed the footage for the 7th time, and watched the woman's calm face and steady pace and the dragon's devastating power, and he had fought, crossed the galaxy, and seen 100 different species and 1,000 different weapons. But nothing like this. His communication console blinked with an incoming priority message, and he opened it and found orders from High Command, and the message was brief and direct and simple: and find the unknown combatant and determine if she represented an asset or a threat to the war effort and bring. The investigation took 3 days of analyzing energy signatures and dimensional distortions and tracking the residual traces left by the dragon's spatial rift, and Vren worked with the station's best scientists, and they finally isolated a pattern that pointed to a specific sector of space. And when they pulled up the galactic charts, everyone in the room went silent. The coordinates led to a region marked in red with warning symbols and quarantine notices, and the official designation was Terra Exclusion Zone Gamma, but most spacers just called it the Dead Zone, and ships that entered never returned. And probes sent and lost contact within hours, and the Galactic Council had sealed it off 200 years ago and forbidden any approach. Kelthas pulled the files and found most of the information heavily redacted and classified at levels that required council authorization to access. And what little remained painted a picture of a planet that should not support life in Class 13 Death World. Designation and the highest danger rating in known space and atmosphere composition that would kill most species in minutes, and gravity that would crush unprotected bodies and predatory fauna that made military weapons look primitive. But there were also fragments of other information and scattered reports from long-range scans and energy signatures that suggested advanced civilization in structure and organization, and someone was living there and not just surviving but thriving. Kira read through the psychological profiles of the survey teams that had approached the zone and found patterns of fear and terror and warnings about things in the dark and creatures that hunted between dimensions, and she did not like the consistency of the reports. And when multiple independent teams reported the same impossible things, those things stopped being impossible. Cleolas called his squad together and laid out the situation and told them they were going into the exclusion zone against orders and against protocol and against common sense, and anyone who wanted to stay behind could do so without judgment, and nobody moved, and they had fought together through 17 battles, and if they were going to break a few rules, they would do it as a unit. The ship they took was small and fast and equipped with the best stealth systems the military had, and they approached the zone carefully and with all sensors on maximum, and Vren monitored the shield strength and weapon readiness. And Kira kept her telepathic senses extended and searching for any mental presence. They crossed the boundary and nothing happened, and no alarms and no attacks, and no mysterious disappearances, and just normal space for the first hour, and then the sensors started picking up gravitational anomalies and energy readings that made no sense, and spatial distortions that bent light in impossible ways. The planet appeared on their screens, and it was beautiful and terrible, and green continents and blue oceans and white clouds, but the readings showed atmosphere with toxin levels that would melt most species and gravity at 3 times. Galactic standard and electromagnetic fields that would fry unshielded electronixcaladas tried to establish orbit, but the ship's systems started going haywire, and defensive systems they had not seen activated and locked onto them in energy. Weapons charged, and his tactical display showed at least 50 targeting solutions, and all of them lethally tried, broadcasting on all frequencies, and explained they meant no harm, and were looking for the woman with the dragon and needed to speak with her. And the targeting systems did not disengage, and after 10 seconds of silence, the weapons fired the ship. Took 3 direct hits, and shields failed, and hull breached, and they were going down in Kelthas. Fought the controls and tried to guide them toward a clearing, but the planet's gravity was brutal, and they hit hard, and the crash threw everyone against their restraints, and alarms screamed in fire. Suppression systems activated. They climbed out of the wreckage and found themselves in a forest that should not exist, and trees that rose hundreds of meters into toxic air, and plants that moved and tracked their movements, and the gravity pressed down on them like a physical weight, and Kelthas felt his bones protesting and his muscles straining. Rin adjusted better than the others, and his crystalline structure was more resistant to gravitational stress, but even he moved carefully and conserved energy and scanned their surroundings. With growing concern, Kira felt the planet's mental presence, and it was vast and alive and aware, and every plant and animal and microorganism connected in a vast network that watched them with curiosity and hunger, and she had never felt anything like it, and it terrified her. The attack came without warning, and creatures burst from the undergrowth, and they were massive and armored and moved with speed that should have been impossible for something so large, and their hides deflected the squad's weapons, and their breath crackled with electromagnetic energicoliths, fired, and his shots bounced off armored scales, and he rolled and dodged and called for concentrated fire, but the creatures kept coming, and there were too many, and they were too fast, and Vren's shields were taking damage, and Kira's telepathic attacks seemed to just make them angrier. Then the dragon landed. The impact shook the ground and sent shock waves through the air, and the massive creature laced itself between the squad and the predators, and its wings spread, and its eyes blazed with violet fire, and the predators stopped and backed away and lowered their heads in submission. The woman walked into view, and she moved easily under the brutal gravity in her silver hair caught the strange light filtering through the toxic atmosphere, and she looked at them with eyes that seemed old and young at the same time, and her expression was calm and mildly curious. She spoke in perfect galactic common, but with an accent that suggested Earth origin, and her voice was clear and steady, and she asked what they were doing on her world, and why they had crashed a military vessel into protected land, Kelthis explained while catching his breath, and the gravity was crushing, and he told her about the battle and her intervention and their orders to find her, and his words came out in gasps, but he got the message across. The woman listened, and her dragon companion watched with intelligent eyes, and when Kelthis finished, she introduced herself as Maya and gestured to the dragon, and said his name was Ember, and they had lived on this world for most of her life. Kira asked the question everyone was thinking, and asked about her ears and her species, and the legends said the Aldari were extinct and had vanished 12,000 years ago, and were the progenitor race that seeded life across the cosmos. Amaya smiled, and it was a sad expression, and said the legends were mostly true, and the Aldari had vanished, but a few survived and fled to places like this world, and places so hostile that nothing would follow them, and they had hidden and died and adapted and waited. Vren asked about the dragon, and pointed out the dragons were mythical and should not exist, and Maya laughed and said that many impossible things existed when you stopped limiting what was possible, and Ember was as real as any of them, and probably older than their civilization's scouts. Tried to negotiate and offered her a deal, and said the Galactic Council would grant her people autonomy and end the quarantine if she helped them win the war, and the Siveran Empire was conquering world after world, and millions were dying. Maya's expression did not change, and she said her people did not want the galaxy's recognition and had chosen isolation deliberately, and had watched the civilized species for thousands of years and seen what they had become, and wanted no part of it. But then Kira did something desperate and reached into Maya's mind with her telepathic abilities, and shared the memories of the war and the burning worlds and the enslaved populations, and the children crying and the soldiers dying and all the suffering that Siveran caused. Maya's eyes darkened, and her calm expression cracked, and Ember growled, and the sound resonated in their bones and made the ground vibrate, and the predators in the forest retreated further, and Maya stood silent for a long moment. She asked about the Siveran, and what they were really after, and why they fought with such determination, and Kelthis admitted they did not know, and the enemy's goals were unclear beyond simple conquest. Maya closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they held a decision, and she said she would help them, but had conditions, and they needed to understand what they were asking and the price. That the Siveran were not simple conquerors, were searching for something in ancient weapons from the Aldari era, in artifacts that could break reality itself, and if the enemy found them, the war would be the least of their problems. Kelthis asked how she knew this, and Maya said her people had spent 12,000 years making sure those weapons stayed lost and hidden and forgotten, and now someone was looking, and that meant her isolation was over. She told them they had a choice, and turn back now and report that they found nothing, or stay and bind themselves to a mission that might cost them everything and there was no middle ground and no safe option. Ren asked what kind of binding, and Maya said it was called a blood compact, and an ancient ritual that would tie their fates together, and if any of them betrayed the mission, the compact would exact punishment. And it was not something to enter light. Like Kira felt the weight of the decision and reached out to the squad telepathically and shared her thoughts, and the 6 hours passed in a blur of preparation, and Maya led them deeper into the forest, and the path wound through trees that seemed to watch them and past streams that glowed with bioluminescent organisms, and the gravity never relented, but somehow their bodies began adapting, and the crushing weight became merely oppressive. They arrived at a clearing where crystalline towers rose from the ground and pulsed with soft light, and the structures were ancient and beautiful, and clearly not built by human hands, and Maya explained these were remnants of her people's civilization and built when the Aldari still walked openly among the stars. Other figures emerged from the shadows, and more elves with the same pointed ears and ageless eyes, and they wore simple clothes and carried themselves with quiet dignity. And they watched the squad with curiosity and caution and some hostility. Older elf approached, and her hair was pure white, and her face lined with age that suggested centuries. And she spoke to Maya in a language that sounded like music and wind, and Maya responded in the same tongue, and their conversation was brief and intense. Maya turned back to the squad and explained that her elder had given permission for the ritual, but warned them that the compact was permanent and binding, and once sealed could only be broken by death, and the elder did not trust outsiders, but trusted Maya's judgment. Van asked if there was another way and some method that did not involve mystical bonds, and Maya shook her head and said the compact was necessary because they would be fighting forces that used both technology and magic, and without the bond they would be vulnerable to manipulation and betrayal. Kira extended her telepathic senses toward the other elves and found their minds protected by barriers she could not penetrate, and their thoughts hidden behind walls of discipline and training, and she realized these people had mastered mental defenses that her entire species had never achieved. The twin moons rose as the sun set and bathed the clearing in silver and blue light, and the crystalline towers responded and began glowing brighter and humming with energy that resonated in their bones. Maya retrieved a blade from one of the towers, and the weapon was ancient and covered in runes that shifted and moved across the metal, and she explained it was a soul knife and forged by her ancestors and designed specifically for rituals. Like this, Sember took his position at the center of the clearing, and the massive dragon settled onto the ground, and his eyes blazed with violet fire, and Maya explained he would serve as witness and anchor, and his presence would ensure the compact held across any distance and any dimension. The ritual began with Maya cutting her palm, and the blade sliced through her skin easily, and blood welled up and dripped onto the ground. Where it fell, the earth glowed and responded, and the crystalline towers pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She passed the blade to Kelthus, and he took it with all 4 hands and felt the weapon's weight and power, and cut his palm, and his purple blood mixed with Maya's on the ground, and the glow intensified. Ron took the blade next, and cutting crystalline flesh was difficult, but the soul knife managed. And his blood was not liquid, but rather streams of light and energy, and when it touched the ground, the glow changed colors and became rainbow-patterned. Skira was last, and her elongated fingers held the blade carefully, and she cut her palm, and her blood was darker and richer than the others, and when it joined the pool, the glow became almost blinding. Maya began speaking in the ancient tongue, and her voice rose and fell in patterns that were clearly practiced in ritual, and the words resonated with power, and the air itself seemed to vibrate and respond, and rejoined his voice to hers. And the dragon's rumble was deep and primal, and carried harmonics that human ears could not fully process, and together their voices created a sound that was music and thunder and prayer all combined. Blood pool began rising and defying gravity, and formed a sphere that floated between them, and spun and pulsed, and tendrils of light extended from the sphere and touched each person, and where the light touched, they felt something fundamental shift. Kelthus felt the connection snap into place, and suddenly he was aware of his squad in a way he had never been before, and he could feel their presence and sense their emotions and know their general location. And it was overwhelming and intimate and Strangevran experienced the bond as mathematical equations and probability, fields and quantum entanglement, and his mind translated the mystical connection into terms he could understand and process, and he realized they were now linked on a fundamental level that transcended normal physics. Kira felt the bond as a telepathic network, but stronger and deeper than anything her species had achieved, and she could sense thoughts and feelings and intentions without actively reading minds, and the connection was automatic and always present. Maya guided them through the rest of the ritual and explained they needed to accept the bond fully and open themselves to the connection and let it settle into their beings and become part of who they were. The blood sphere expanded and enveloped them all, and for a moment they existed in a space between spaces and saw each other's memories and fears and hopes and dreams, and the experience was raw and unfiltered and impossibly intimate. Tekethus saw Maya's past and her training on this brutal world and learning to survive among predators that could kill with a thought, and bonding with Ember when he was small enough to hold, and growing together and facing dangers that would destroy civilizations. Maya saw Kelthus memories and his 200 years of war, and the friends lost and victories won, and the weight of command and the fear that one day his luck would run out and his squad would die. Because of his decisions, Ron's memories were alien and strange, and his people experienced time differently in his past. This was not linear, but rather layered and crystallized. In frozen moments of perfect clarity and understanding, Raz memories were even stranger, and her species did not think in images but in emotions and connections, and her past was a web of relationships and mental bonds, and the constant struggle to maintain her own identity among so many other minds. Then the sphere collapsed and the light faded, and they were standing in the clearing again, and physically unchanged but fundamentally different, and the bond was there and permanent and active and humming between them like a living thing. Maya flexed her hand, and the cut had already healed, and she explained that the compact would protect them from mental manipulation and magical interference and betrayal from within, and if any of them broke faith, the bond would know and exact punishment. Keelas asked what kind of punishment, and Maya's expression became grim, and she said the compact would sever the betrayer's connection to life itself, and death would be instant and absolute, and there would be no warning and no second chance. Friend calculated the implications and realized they had just placed their lives in each other's hands in the most literal sense possible, and any one of them could theoretically trigger the compact's punishment if they acted against the group's interest. Kira felt the weight of the commitment and reached out through the new bond and felt her squad mates and Maya and even Ember's vast ancient presence, and realized they were now a family in a way that transcended species and culture and choice. Maya led them back through the forest, and the predators they had encountered earlier now gave them wide berth and seemed to sense the change and recognize the bond and respect what it represented. They arrived at a structure built into the side of a cliff, and the building was part technology and part magic and rooms carved from living stone and filled with equipment that blended both disciplines seamlessly. Mia showed them her armory and weapons that channeled life force and turned biological energy into devastating attacks, and armor that repaired itself and adapted to threats and tools that should not exist, according to USC Galactic Science. She began equipping herself and selected a rifle that glowed with runes and a sidearm that hummed with contained power and armor that seemed liquid until she put it on. And then it solidified and became flexible. Metal Ember watched from outside, and his massive head filled the doorway, and his eyes tracked Maya's preparations with obvious approval, and the bond between dragon and rider was visible and tangible. And ancient Keelthas asked about their first target and where they would strike, and Maya pulled up a holographic display that showed Severan territory and highlighted a fortress world on the outer rim, and explained it housed intelligence on the artifacts and needed to be hit hard and fast. Vryn analyzed the fortress defenses and calculated their odds and came up with numbers that were not encouraging, and the facility was heavily defended and reinforced and designed to withstand major military assaults. Kira reached out through the bond and felt Maya's confidence and determination and lack of fear, and realized the elf was not being reckless, but rather operating from experience and knowledge. They did not possess Maya, finished her preparations and checked her weapons one last time and asked if they were ready, and her tone made it clear there was no going back, and once they started this mission, they would see it through to whatever end Kelthus looked at his squad and felt the bond humming between them and saw determination in their faces and eyes and knew they were as ready as they would. Everbehi told Maya they were ready, and she smiled and said then they would leave at dawn in Emberwood. The dimensional travel lasted seconds and eternities simultaneously, and when Ember emerged from the rift, they were in orbit around the Siveran Fortress world, and the transition was so smooth the squad barely felt it, and Maya slid from the dragons back and gestured for them to follow, and they descended toward the planet's surface under cover of Ember's natural stealth abilities. The fortress rose from a barren landscape and was massive and dark and covered in weapons, platforms, and shield generators and sensor arrays, and Keltha's tactical mind cataloged at least 50 different defensive systems, and every one of them lethal and overlapping and designed to prevent exactly what they were attempting. Maya did not seem concerned, and she moved with the same calm pace she had shown at Station Omega-7, and explained they would not assault the fortress directly, but rather infiltrate and gather intelligence and eliminate key targets and let chaos do the rest of the work. They landed a kilometer from the outer perimeter, and Ember phase shifted and became partially invisible in his massive form, blended with shadows and rock, and became nearly impossible to detect. And Maya explained that the dragon could manipulate his own dimensional presence and exist partially in normal space and partially elsewhere. The approach was tense and careful, and they moved through terrain that offered minimal cover and passed sensor grids that should have detected them, but Maya led them along paths that somehow avoided detection. And when Kelthus asked how she knew, she simply said death worlds taught you to understand patterns and movement and energy flow. They reached the outer wall, and Maya placed her hand against the barrier and closed her eyes, and the runes on her armor began glowing, and after a moment the wall shimmered and became permeable, and they walked through solid matter like it was Fogvrin analyzed the phenomenon, and his crystalline mind tried to categorize it and failed. And this was not technology and not any physical process, he understood, and Maya explained it was called phase walking, and her people had learned it from studying how Ember moved between dimensions. Inside the fortress they found themselves in maintenance tunnels, and the passages were dark and cramped and filled with the hum of machinery, and Maya moved through them like she had memorized the layout. And Kelthas realized through the bond that she was somehow reading the fortress itself and understanding its structure through methods he could not comprehend. They encountered their first patrol, and 6 Siveran soldiers moving in standard formation, and Maya did not slow her pace, and her rifle came up and fired, and the shots were nearly silent, and each one found a target, and the soldiers dropped before they could raise an alarm. Kelthas had seen plenty of combat, but Maya's efficiency was different, and she did not react to threats, and she anticipated them and moved into position before enemies appeared and shot before they raised weapons, and her entire approach was about prediction rather than response. Kura felt through the bond that Maya was not reading minds, but rather understanding probability and cause, an effect in seeing how actions would unfold based on patterns and training, and Maya had spent her life on a world where hesitation meant death, and her survival instincts were honed to a degree that seemed supernatural. They reached a junction, and Maya signaled for them to wait, and she moved forward alone and disappeared around a corner in 30 seconds. Later she returned and gestured for them to follow, and when they rounded the corner, they found 8 more Siveran soldiers dead, and their bodies arranged to not trigger motion sensors. Ren asked how she predicted their patrol routes, and Maya explained that Death World predators followed patterns, and soldiers were just predators with rules, and once you understood the rules, you could predict the patterns and exploit them. They descended deeper into the fortress and passed security checkpoints and guard posts and weapon emplacements, and Maya led them through blind spots and gaps in coverage and used phase walking when necessary. And the deeper they went, the more Kjelthus realized they were not just infiltrating, but hunting. The intelligence vault was 3 levels below ground and protected by systems that would make a frontal assault suicidal, and energy barriers and automated defenses and guard rotations and biometric locks. And Maya studied it for exactly 40 seconds and then began dismantling the security with practiced efficiency. Used her rifle to disable power junctions and her armor's runes, to disrupt energy fields, and her own knowledge to bypass biometric locks, and within 5 minutes they were inside, and the vault's alarms had never triggered. 8. Data storage was extensive, and Kjelthus began copying files in his military hardware, interfaced with the Siverin systems, and pooled intelligence about troop movements and supply lines and strategic targets. And then he found the classified section about artifacts. The files were horrifying and detailed and showed that the Siverin had been searching for ancient Eldari weapons for decades and had located 3 of 7 artifacts called Sundering Keys, and each key could tear open dimensional barriers and access something called the Void. Between Maya's reaction was immediate and visceral, and her calm composure shattered, and her face went pale, and she grabbed Kjelthus and demanded to see the files, and her hands shook and threw the bond. They all felt her fear, and it was raw and primal and absolute. She read through the intelligence, and her silver eyes grew wider and darker, and she began cursing in the ancient tongue, and her voice was tight and strained. And when she finished, she looked at them, and her expression was haunted. She explained that the void between was why the Eldari had vanished, and they had opened a door to that realm thinking they could control it and use its power, and they had been wrong, and catastrophically wrong, and what came through had consumed their civilization. The survivors had fled and scattered and hidden and bound themselves to death worlds and places so hostile that the things from the void would not follow, and they had spent 12,000 years making sure those doors stayed closed and those keys stayed lost now. The Siverin had found 3 keys and were searching for the remaining 4, and their goal was not conquest, but ascension, and the Empress believed she could harness the Void's power and become something beyond mortal and beyond physical and achieve godhood. Maya said this was worse than war and worse than extinction, and if the Siverin opened that gateway, it would not just end their species, but end all life and all reality, and everything would be consumed and dragged into the endless dark. Kjelthus asked what they should do, and Maya's answer was simple and terrifying, and they had to kill the Empress and destroy the keys and do it before the ritual was completed. And the timeline, according to the files, was less than a month. Friend calculated the probability of success, and his numbers were grim, and they were 1 squad against an empire, and the Empress was protected by armies and fleets and fortress worlds, and the tactical situation was effectively impossibly upheld through the bond. That Maya was not concerned with probability, and she had lived on a world where impossible was just the starting point, and survival meant doing what should not be possible and succeeding. Where logic said you should fail, Maya began downloading additional intelligence, and her hands moved quickly and efficiently, and she pulled data on the Empress's location and the other keys and the SHEs and the ritual requirements and security protocols, and within minutes she had built a picture of what they faced. The Empress was on the throne world and protected by 3 full battle fleets and planetary shields and an army of elite guards, and the keys were stored in separate vaults, and the ritual site was at the planet's core and accessed through dimensional gates that only the Empress could open. Maya finished copying the data and turned to face them, and her expression was set and determined. And she said they had a choice, and they could report this to the Galactic Council and let the military handle it and probably fail, or they could take the mission themselves and do what needed to be done. Kjelthus understood what she was really asking, and she was offering them an out and a chance to walk away before things became truly suicidal, and they had fulfilled their part of the bargain by helping infiltrate the fortress and gather intelligence. He looked at his squad and felt the bond connecting them, and saw Determination in their faces, and Vren's crystalline form was steady in Kira's. Telepathic presence was calm and resolved, and they had fought together through 17 battles, and this would be their 18th, he told Maya. They were committed, and the bond had tied their fates together, and they would see this through too. Whatever end came, and Maya smiled, and it was grateful and sad, and she said then they needed to move because Fortress. Alarms had just been triggered. The security breach had been discovered, and alerts were blaring, and soldiers were mobilizing, and automated defenses were activating, and they had maybe 3 minutes before the entire facility locked down and trapped them inside Maya. Led them running through corridors, and they moved fast and hard, and used the chaos to their advantage. And when soldiers appeared, they were eliminated quickly and efficiently, and left behind as the squad pushed toward the exit. They reached the outer wall, and Maya Phase walked them through, and they emerged into open air, and Ember was already there, and his massive form materialized from shadows, and they climbed onto his back, and the dragon launched skyward with powerful wing strokes. The journey to the throne world took 2 weeks of preparation and planning and gathering intelligence, and Maya led them to hidden outposts and resistance cells and people who had been fighting the Siverin for decades, and together they built a picture of the Empress's defenses and found the weaknesses that would let them penetrate the seemingly impenetrable. The throne world appeared before them and was massive and dark, and covered in cities that glowed with artificial light and orbital platforms that bristled with weapons, and the 3 battle fleets were visible as they patrolled in precise formations, and everything about the planet screamed power and dominance and control. Maya explained the plan, and it was audacious and insane, and relied on timing and coordination and the bond between them, and they would split up and hit multiple targets simultaneously and create chaos and confusion, and use that chaos to reach the ritual site at the planet's core. Ember would carry Maya directly to the Empress's palace and serve as both transport and weapon, and his ability to phase between dimensions would let them bypass the outer defenses and get close before anyone realized they were their Akelthas, and his squad would infiltrate the key vaults and destroy the sundering keys and prevent the ritual from being completed, even if Maya failed to stop the Empress, and it was a backup plan and a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. The bond hummed between them and carried shared emotions and determination and fear and acceptance, and they had fought together and bled together, and now they would face the end together, and there was comfort in that knowledge. Ember dove toward the planet, and his wings cut through space, and atmosphere and defensive systems activated and tried to track him. But the dragon phase shifted and became partially intangible in attacks. Passed through his form and exploded harmlessly behind them, they reached the upper atmosphere and separated. And Kelthas and his squad dropped in stealth pods and fell toward different key vault locations, and Maya and Ember continued toward the palace, and the bond stretched but held, and they could still feel each other across the distance. Kelthas pod hit the surface near the first vault, and he emerged into chaos, and alarms were already blaring, and soldiers were mobilizing, and someone had detected their approach, and the element of surprise was compromised, but they had expected that he fought his way toward the vault, and his weapons blazed, and his forearms moved in perfect coordination, and years of combat experience guided every motion, and behind him he felt Ren and Kira fighting at their own locations, and through the bond he knew they were succeeding. The vault doors were massive and reinforced and designed to withstand orbital bombardment, and Kelthas planted charges and set timers and moved to cover, and the explosion was massive and tore through the doors and exposed the interior. Inside he found the first sundering key, and it was ancient and beautiful and terrible, and covered in runes that hurt to look at, and hummed with power that made reality itself feel thin and fragile. And he understood why Maya had been so terrified. He placed charges around the key and activated them and ran in the explosion. When it came was not normal fire and energy, but something else, and the key shattered, and where it broke, reality screamed, and dimensional tears opened and closed and stabilized, and the vault collapsed into itself. Through the bond he felt Friend succeeded his target, and the second key was destroyed, and then Kira finished her mission, and the third key was gone, and 3 of the 7 sundering keys were now permanently destroyed, and that left 4 in the Empress's possession. Keylets tried to reach the extraction point, but enemy forces were converging and blocking his path, and he was surrounded and outnumbered, and his weapons were running low on ammunition, and his shields were failing, and he knew he was not getting out through the bond. He felt his squad in similar situations and trapped and fighting to their last breath, and he felt Maya far above, engaged in her own desperate battle, and the bond carried her determination and her fear and her resolve. The palace, Maya and Ember crashed through defensive barriers and energy shields and landed in the throne chamber with force that shook the entire structure, and the Empress was there, and she was tall and elegant and radiating power that felt wrong and twisted and corrupted by whatever she had touched in her pursuit of godhood. The remaining 4 sundering keys orbited around the Empress and glowed with sickly light, and reality bent around them and through them, and the ritual was already beginning, and the void between was pressing against the barriers of normal space and trying to break through. Maya fired her rifle, and the shots should have killed, but the Empress gestured, and energy barriers caught the rounds and exploded them harmlessly, and she laughed and said the Aldari were too late, and the ritual was already in motion and could not be stopped. Timur attacked, and his violet flames washed over the Empress. Anne should have incinerated her, but she absorbed the energy and redirected it and blasted the dragon backward, and Ember crashed into palace walls and roared in pain and fury. Maya felt the bond connecting her to Kelthus and Vren and Kira, and felt them dying and fighting their last battles and succeeding in their missions, and she drew strength from their sacrifice and determination. She reached deep into herself and into her connection with Ember and pulled on power they had been saving and hoarding and protecting for exactly this moment, and her body began glowing with runic light, and her armor blazed, and her weapons channeled life force in amounts that should have killed. Hertha Empress noticed the change, and her expression shifted from amusement to concern, and she began chanting in an ancient tongue, and the ritual accelerated, and the void between tore open, and reality shattered like glass. Things began emerging in entities that should not exist, and existed in states of contradiction and impossibility, and they reached with appendages that were and were not there, and touched reality, and wherever they touched things, ceased to exist, and were not destroyed but rather erased from having ever been. Maya understood they had seconds and not minutes, and the ritual could not be stopped. But maybe it could be sealed and reversed and contained, and her people had created a failsafe for exactly this scenario, and it required a sacrifice that she had always known she might have to make. She reached out to Kelthas through the bond and felt him still fighting and still alive, and told him what needed to be done, and that she was sorry, and that their service had mattered, and he and his squad had made the difference. Aquilas felt her intention and tried to argue and tried to offer alternatives, but Maya cut him off and reminded him of the blood compact, and they had sworn to complete the mission, and this was what completion required. And there was no other way. She turned to Ember, and the dragon lowered his massive head, and their eyes met, and in that moment the bond between rider and dragon carried everything that words could not express, and grief, and acceptance, and love, and love, and love. The knowledge that some prices must be paid, and roared, and it was not a sound of challenge but of grief and farewell, and he rose on powerful legs and spread his wings, and together they launched toward the tier in reality and toward the things. Emerging from the void, Maya channeled every ounce of power she possessed and pulled from Ember and from the bond and from her own life force, and she began speaking the ancient words of the sealing ritual, and her ancestors had created it, taught it, and passed it down through generations for exactly this moment. The Empress tried to stop them and threw everything she had at the dragon and rider, but Maya and Ember were beyond such things now, and they had committed fully in their combined power was absolute and ancient and primal. They plunged into the void, and reality inverted around them, and they existed in a space between spaces and saw the things that had consumed the Aldari and understood why their people had fled and hidden. And they stood against them anyway. Maya completed the ritual and used her life, and Ember's essence as an anchor and sealed the breach from the inside. And the dimensional tear began closing, and the things from the void were pushed back and trapped. And contained, the Empress screamed and tried to maintain the ritual, but with Maya's sacrifice, the sundering keys lost their power and shattered. And the backlash of energies consumed the Empress and erased her from existence and her throne, and palace and city burned with violet fire. The breach collapsed in an explosion that could be seen from orbit in silver light and violet. Flames washed across the throne world, and when it cleared, the palace was gone and the Empress was gone. And the void was sealed. Kilthus felt the bond snap, and the connection that had tied them all together severed, and in that moment he knew. Maya and Ember were gone, and not dead, but rather standing guard on the other side of reality and holding the door, closed forever. The Siveran Empire broke without the Empress, and leadership collapsed, and fleets surrendered, and the war ended not with triumph, but with hollow victory and millions. Saved, but at a cost that felt too high. Months passed, and the galaxy tried to recover and rebuild in the 44th Tactical Response Unit was honored and celebrated and given medals and commendations, and Kelthus accepted them with empty hands and hollow heart. He stood with Vren and Kira at a memorial on Maya's death world, and her people had erected it and carved from living stone and inscribed with her name and embers, and the elders spoke words in the ancient